It's 7:47 on a December morning in Morden, Manitoba. Many people are just sipping their morning coffee, getting ready for the day ahead. The sun will soon rise, the beautiful colors of dawn will be cast across the sky. Listen closely, you can hear the world come back to life. But that wasn't the case for Lawrence Goland. That's because at 7:47, the freezing dawn approaching Goland's life was about to end, cut short by a snap of a hangman's rope. Welcome. You're listening to The Dark Side of the Prairies, written and produced by the creative media students at Assiniboine Community College, telling the hidden stories of Westman's darker days. I'm Sydney Houston. Will we ever know what drives someone to kill? The day was May 22nd, 1907. Lawrence Goland committed a truly awful crime. But Goland's story makes me wonder, was it his tortured past that caused him to break with reality? Or did he always conceal a dark side, one that could go as far as murder? Before we answer that question, here's the story. Lawrence Goland was born in 1887 in Keston, Wensley, Yorkshire, England. Lawrence was only 8 years old when his father died. 2 months later, one of his younger sisters died. That left his mother, Sarah, with no help to raise Lawrence and his 5 brothers and sisters. By 1901, the Goland family had become inmates of the Leeds Union Workhouse. The British government created workhouses as a last resort for the most poverty-stricken. Conditions were deliberately harsh so that only the most desperate would go there. The workhouse was a place where families ate, slept, and toiled in misery. They lived in what was then called the horrors of the workhouse. Oxford University noted that many developed a kind of hopeless lethargy, a zombie-like stupor. The food was inadequate. The forced labor was cruel and unsafe, breaking rocks and picking ropes. Diseases like typhus, smallpox, and chloria would spread like wildfire through the workhouse. Soon enough, Lawrence's mother, Sarah, fell sick. She was taken away from her children. They would never see her again. Then, the children were separated from each other and shunted off to orphanages. After being stripped away from everything and everyone they knew, over 100,000 British orphan children were put on ships and sent across the ocean to Canada. They became known as the British Home Children. Around 3,600 of the kids were shipped by train to Manitoba. One of them was Lawrence Goland. Like others, Lawrence was sent to live and work for farmers. They lived in isolation, alone, and working in slave-like conditions. Lawrence spent a year at a training farm in Russell. Then he went and spent a year at a farm north of Manitou. And finally, he became a worker on a farm owned by the Brown family, located 2 miles outside of Killarney. It was there, on May 22nd, 1907, that Lawrence's short life was about to reach its most tragic twist. 22-year-old Georgina Brown kept house for her brother John. She was home alone on this afternoon. Her brother stepped away from the farm. It was just after dinner, and the sun was beginning to set. Golden rays of sunshine cast shadows into Georgina's changing room. She was partially finished changing when she heard these soft footsteps on the squeaky old floorboards. The evidence later showed that the perpetrator had removed his shoes so he could quietly creep down the hallway. Then the door to the room creaked open, and Georgina was suddenly face to face with one of her brother's workers, Lawrence Goland. Lawrence pounced on Georgina, pushing for sex. There was a clear struggle. Cuts on Georgina's hands and arms show that she fought back ferociously. Lawrence grabbed and pulled at her clothes, leaving red marks across her delicate skin. It is not known for certain if Lawrence got what he wanted that night, but the fight ended when Georgina's throat was sliced with a razor blade. Was it a sudden, unplanned action? As Georgina bled heavily from her wound, as Lawrence looked around at the room in shambles, decorations smashed, clothes thrown around, and Georgina laying in her own pool of blood. Did Lawrence regret his gut-turning act? Lawrence tried to take his life by doing exactly what he had just done to Georgina, slicing his own neck using a butcher knife he found in the Brown family kitchen. Only the return of Georgina's brother to the farm saved his life. At least, temporarily. Georgina was dead. The crime shocked the province. The Manitoba Free Press called it vicious, diabolical, a horrible tragedy, and almost too gruesome to believe. The paper noted Georgina's clothes were literally torn into strips. The writer seemed shocked that evidence showed Lawrence had calmly smoked 2 cigarettes. The paper also said that many local farmers and townspeople were looking at any stranger with fear and suspicion. They didn't need to worry. The only suspect was in custody, and he was ready to confess. This has me wondering. He was so quick to confess. Did he deserve the death penalty? Lawrence didn't have a lawyer or anyone in his corner. He was alone in this world, a world he barely knew. In a courtroom with just a few people present, a constable read Lawrence's confession out loud for the record. About 12 o'clock, I came in to dinner and went out and sat on the veranda, and John went out to feed the pigs. Georgina called me an English brat. I had my boots and stockings off. I took my razor with me. Georgina was standing at the south window on the floor. I went in and took a hold of her and started wrestling with her. She got me down and took the razor from me. I got the razor back and cut her throat with it while she was wrestling with me. The razor broke and I lost it. Could not find it. I wanted then to find a razor to cut my own throat, but could not find one. I got the butcher knife, took it upstairs, and laid it on the bed. I then went into the room above the kitchen and made a cigarette. Went into my own room and commenced cutting my own throat, and then went and laid down on the bed and finished cutting my throat. Then I put the knife on the floor next to the wall. I could see John coming when I cut my own throat. He was about a mile away, coming home. I was sorry after I cut Georgina's throat, and I thought I would cut my own throat then. The public was outraged. In July, Lawrence appeared briefly at a court in Winnipeg, and a crowd pushed in on him. A reporter described him as a thick-set, unintelligent-looking man with a red scar across his neck. What the newspaper and public seemed to find most shocked was that Lawrence showed no signs of shame or embarrassment. Only what was said to be a sarcastic smile. The reporter wrote that this was because Lawrence knew, quote, every man's hand was against him. A brief trial took place in Morden on October 22nd. The government claimed it didn't have the $50 to pay for Lawrence's lawyer. The judge asked him to defend himself, but Lawrence made no defense. His only sign of emotion was when a nurse produced a letter he'd written to his mother. The reporter simply said Lawrence was, quote, visibly affected during its reading in court. The jury spent around 10 minutes deliberating. Lawrence was given the death penalty. Strangely, the Manitoba Free Press reported that the judge broke down while sentencing Lawrence, overcome by emotions. But Lawrence himself was said to have regained his composure and left court with a firm step. On December 13th, 1907, at 7:47, Lawrence was in his cell in the Mordentown jail. Sitting on his bed, he could feel the hard metal slates through the paper-thin mattress. Some folks had tried to convince the government in Ottawa to reprieve Lawrence. One group of Killarney residents organized a request that Lawrence be sentenced to life imprisonment instead of death. But now, it was too late. A prominent Manitoba contractor had already built the scaffold for his execution, a wooden enclosure 12 feet by 14 feet next to the jail. In a story written a few days before his execution, the reporter said Lawrence was in good spirits. The news stories added that Lawrence was held in high regard by the jail staff, and he was described as an excellent prisoner. Now it was time for Lawrence's story to come to an end. He was only 21 years old. He could probably hear the footsteps of the sheriff and his men walking down the quiet hallway, growing louder and louder until they reached the door of his cell. The sheriff was surprised when Lawrence calmly stood up and joined the process towards the gallows. 2 jailers stood on either side of Lawrence, and a reverend led the way, reading from the Bible as the small group reached the scaffold. They supported Lawrence onto the scaffold, but as the Manitoba Free Press reported, he had a steady stride and showed no nervousness whatsoever. Lawrence was calm, cool, and collected, as if he already assumed his fate. The scaffold was 65 feet high in the air. Lawrence, the newspaper said, held his head high as he was belted into position, a reverend reading scripture to him. The hangman was anonymous, his fake name recorded as G. Mick on a hotel reservation list. He wore a fake mustache and beard to further hide his identity. The reverend now began reading the Lord's Prayer. The executioner placed a black hood over Lawrence's head, then moved over to the lever that would open the trapdoor beneath the condemned man's feet. When the reverend reached the words, "Thy kingdom come," that was the signal. As the newspaper described it, the hangman pulled the lever and Lawrence was shot into eternity. For 6 minutes, Lawrence's heart beat ever so slightly. A doctor listened as it slowly got more and more faint, and Lawrence's body relaxed into his fate until exactly 8:20, when he was pronounced dead. Everyone reportedly cheered that it was, quote, a most successful execution. The question is still on the table of history. Was Lawrence destined to be a killer? Or were the hardships he faced too much for the young man and caused him to have a break with reality? The Manitoba Free Press reported on an interview with the Reverend who spent time with Lawrence in his cell before the execution. The Reverend told the reporter that Lawrence had been, quote, a good boy and a faithful servant up to the time of this terrible crime. As for the crime itself, the Reverend blamed a fit of ungovernable rage. Surely this isn't the life Lawrence expected for himself, being stripped from everything he knew. His father and sister's deaths, being separated from his mother and siblings, never to see them again. Shipped off to a new world where he was beaten, starved, and treated like a slave. Maybe he loved Georgina and he thought he was going to lose her and couldn't stand another loss. This is something we will never know. Lawrence had no lawyer, no family, no one to tell his side of the story. He did the crime, but was he truly guilty? You've been listening to The Dark Side of the Prairies, written and produced by the creative media students at Assiniboine Community College, telling the hidden stories of Westman's darker days. Check out our other episodes. You can hear them all on CJ 106. Many thanks to the instructors and staff of Assiniboine Community College, and to you also. Thanks for listening. I'm Sydney Houston. Good night.